Blackstone Penitentiary, a large and intimidating prison, sat at the edge of a foggy forest. Its high walls and sharp barbed wire used to be a strong symbol of security, keeping the most dangerous criminals locked inside. For many years, life in the prison followed a strict routine, and in a strange way, it offered a sense of stability. However, recently, that calm was broken. It started with whispers, low and unclear sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, as if they were floating through the thick concrete walls. The guards began to hear their names being called out from dark corners of the prison, even though no one was there. Some prisoners said they could hear voices crying and screaming in their cells during the night. The strangest part was the metallic clangs that echoed through the halls, as if someone was hammering at the very walls of the prison. Then, the first real sign of something wrong happened in cell block C. A tough inmate, known for his quiet and calm nature, was found lying on the floor in a fetal position. He was mumbling about seeing shadowy figures in his cell. His cellmate said he saw a black mist rise from the floor and surround the man before it disappeared. Soon, more stories like this started to spread. Invisible hands touching arms, a feeling of being watched, and the eerie sensation of something cold and heavy breathing down their necks. As fear grew, more and more prisoners became convinced that the prison was haunted. Now some refused to leave their cells, even to eat, and guards started quitting in large numbers, saying the place was cursed. Warden Blake, a man known for his strong leadership, found himself unable to stop the rising panic. Then came the footage. The security cameras captured strange shadows, moving down the hallways as if they had a purpose, but no one could see what was causing them. In the infirmary, a chair moved across the floor by itself. Even Warden Blake, who had always been a skeptic, began to feel that something was seriously wrong, because the air in the prison felt thick and heavy, as if something invisible was pressing down on everyone, making it hard to think clearly. Despite all the efforts to keep control, the prison began to fall into chaos, and the line between what was real and what was imagined became harder to see. Now a dark question haunted everyone. What had been awakened inside Blackstone's walls? Then, the prison board quickly decided to launch an investigation. A team of experts was brought in, carrying sensors, cameras, and other scientific tools. 4 days, they searched every corner of Blackstone Penitentiary and tried to find something unusual. But despite their efforts, they couldn't find any solid explanation. But the strange events continued. The team spent hours going over the footage again and again. The shadows captured in the recordings were impossible to explain. One clip showed what seemed like a faint outline of a hand gently brushing against a sleeping inmate's face. Another video showed a guard's baton being pulled from his belt and thrown across the room. But there was no sign of anyone touching the baton, and no one could explain how it moved. Frustrated and running out of options, Warden Blake called a meeting with his staff in the conference room. He said, "If anyone has a rational solution, now is the time to speak." Suddenly, Officer Jake raised his hand slowly, as if unsure of what to say. "I think we need to consider unconventional help." Suddenly, the room fell silent, and the others looked at him with disbelief. Then Blake asked, "What are you suggesting?" Jake said quietly, "A paranormal expert. Someone who understands these things. There is a man I have read about, and his name is Daniel Cross. He has helped people before. Maybe he can help us." Blake frowned because the idea sounded completely ridiculous to him. But when he looked around at his staff, who seemed more afraid with every passing day, he couldn't ignore the growing tension. The strange whispers, the strange visions, the things that couldn't be explained. It was all too much. "Fine," he finally said. "Bring him in, but I'm not convinced we're dealing with anything other than mass hysteria." As the staff started to leave the room, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far darker than they realized. Ever since the strange occurrences began, he had a growing sense that something was watching them, and it was something beyond their understanding. Daniel Cross lived in a small and cluttered house on the edge of the city. The walls were filled with old books on the paranormal, and their covers were worn from many years of use. The air in the house smelled faintly of sage and something older, almost ancient, as if the house itself carried a history of things unseen. When the call from Blackstone came, Daniel hesitated. He had spent many years avoiding high-profile cases, and chose instead to help ordinary people dealing with strange and unexplained events. But the voice on the other end of the line, Officer Jake, sounded desperate. "Mr. Cross, please, we need your help because something is happening in Blackstone, and we can't explain it." Daniel sighed and felt the weight of his own past pressing down on him. He remembered the shadows that had haunted his childhood home, shadows that whispered his name, and his mother's cries as strange forces took control of her. He had been just a boy back then, and he was powerless to stop it. But now, years later, he was older, wiser, and better prepared to face such darkness. "Fine," Daniel said. His voice was steady. "I'll come." The iron gates of Blackstone Penitentiary creaked open with a loud groan as Daniel Cross stepped inside. Immediately, he felt the air grow heavier, almost suffocating, as if something was pressing down on him. A chill crept into his bones, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He had been to many haunted places before, but this one was different, darker, more hostile. The long corridors stretched out in front of him, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast uneasy shadows on the cracked walls. As he walked deeper into the prison, he heard something, a faint whisper, just on the edge of his hearing. It rose and fell, like a sinister lullaby. But no matter how hard he focused, the words stayed just out of reach. Daniel paused near an empty cell and placed his hand against the cold iron bars. Immediately, a rush of emotions hit him: rage, despair, and an overwhelming sense of suffering. Then he staggered slightly and gripped the bars for support as flashes of images filled his mind. Anguished faces, violent struggles, and the heavy weight of guilt. For a moment, it felt as if the prison itself was speaking to him and showing him the pain that had been buried within its walls. "Mr. Cross," a voice suddenly called, breaking the spell. Daniel turned to see a man in his early 50s approaching. His face was lined with exhaustion, and his eyes held a deep worrying. This was Warden Blake, the man who had reluctantly agreed to bring him in. Blake extended his hand, and Daniel shook it firmly. "Thank you for coming," Blake said, his voice formal but edged with desperation. "I will admit, I wasn't keen on the idea of bringing in someone like you, but we are out of options." Daniel nodded curtly, and he said simply, "What's happening here isn't ordinary. You made the right call." Blake led Daniel through the facility and explained the strange events that had been happening. As they passed the infirmary, Daniel suddenly froze. A chair, which had been stationary just moments before, slid across the floor with a loud screech. To Blake, he jumped and his face went pale. Then Blake muttered, "That kind of thing. It happens a lot." Later, they continued walking, and soon, a woman joined them. She was wearing a crisp uniform, and her stance was guarded. Officer Elena Torres introduced herself with a firm handshake. Unlike Blake, she didn't try to hide her skepticism. Then she said, "So you're the ghost whisperer. No offense, but I will believe it when I see it." Daniel smirked faintly and replied, "You might regret that." Elena raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond. It was clear she was curious, but she wanted to keep a professional distance. Then, the group stopped outside cell block C, where they met Marcus Gray, a hardened prisoner known for his tough exterior. But the man sitting on the bunk in front of them didn't look tough at all. His hands were shaking, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. "It's real," Gray whispered as Daniel stepped closer. "I have seen it. Every night, a shadow. It watches me. Daniel sat across from him, and his voice was calm. Tell me what you have seen. Every detail matters. Gray hesitated before describing the figure. It was tall, featureless, with burning red eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. He spoke of its slow, deliberate movements as if it enjoyed stalking him. Gray added, "It doesn't say anything, but I feel it in my head, like it's crawling around in there." As Gray spoke, Daniel felt the temperature in the cell drop. His breath came out in faint puffs, and a familiar sense of dread washed over him. He glanced toward the corner of the room and froze, because he saw a shadow shift. It didn't come from the overhead lights, and it didn't match the shape of anything in the cell. The shadow moved slowly across the wall, like a snake, before vanishing into the darkness. "Did you see that?" Aylin asked, and her voice was trembling despite her effort to stay calm. "I did," Daniel replied grimly. "This place is alive with something, and it's not just haunting us. It's feeding on us." "What does that mean?" Blake asked, and his face grew even paler. Daniel stood up slowly, his gaze locked on the empty corner of the room. Then he said, "It means whatever is here isn't just an echo of the past. It's intelligent, malevolent, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." Blake turned away, and guilt washed over him. To Elena, her skepticism faded and was replaced by a mixture of fear and determination. But Daniel remained calm, already piecing together the puzzle of the darkness that gripped Blackstone. "This is only the beginning," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "And if we don't act fast, things will get much worse." Daniel sat in the dimly lit office of Warden Blake, and he was surrounded by stacks of old records and worn-out blueprints. The air was thick with the musty smell of paper, mixed with a faint metallic scent that seemed to always hang around Blackstone Penitentiary. As he carefully looked through the prison's past, more and more disturbing patterns started to appear. "This place wasn't just built on bad land," Daniel said quietly, glancing up at Blake and Elena. "It is full of violence from the very beginning." Blake frowned and said, "What are you talking about?" Daniel picked up an old map, its edges brown and fragile. This land was used for public executions back in the colonial days. People came to watch hangings and floggings because it was a kind of show for them. Then, when the prison was being built, workers claimed they could hear screams coming from the ground. Of course, they just ignored it. Elena moved closer, and her usual disbelief started to fade. "And what about the massacre? And the one the prisoners keep whispering about?" Daniel nodded gravely. "In 1947, there was a riot in Cell Block D. It started because the prison was overcrowded, and the conditions were terrible. The guards responded with brutal force and killed many of the inmates. Officially, they said it was the prisoners' fault, but the survivors talked about cold-blooded killings carried out to send a message." Blake shifted and looked uncomfortable. That was before my time," Daniel said, his tone sharp, convenient. "But the energy from those events is still here. Violence like that doesn't just disappear. It leaves scars, not just on the people, but on the place itself." Just then, a loud bang echoed through the office. Suddenly Ellen jumped and quickly reached for her gun. But the door, which had been slightly open, was now shut tight. Elena said, "Tell me you have an explanation for that." Her voice was shaking despite her tough appearance. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the door and placed his hand on it. The wood felt strangely cold, as if it was alive. Closing his eyes, he felt a wave of sorrow and anger wash over him, almost too strong to handle. "This isn't just a haunting," Daniel said after a long pause. "It's retribution. Something, or someone, wants justice." Blake's face went even paler, but he still managed to ask, "What do we do?" "Keep digging," Daniel replied firmly. "There is more to this story, and finding the answers won't be easy." As they continued to search through the records, the lights above them flickered, and the whispers around them grew louder. Each discovery seemed to anger the unseen forces in the prison. Now a sense of urgency filled the air, as if something was pressing down on them, and it was making it harder to breathe. Then Elena whispered, "This place, it is alive." But Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the truth was clear. Now the prison's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. What had started as eerie whispers and fleeting shadows soon turned into something much worse. Doors slammed shut without warning, trapping both guards and prisoners inside. Chairs slid across the floors on their own, and objects flew through the air as if pushed by invisible hands. One night, a prisoner in cell block C screamed so loudly that his cries echoed through the entire facility. When the guards reached him, they found deep, jagged scratches across his back, as though something with claws had attacked him. He swore that he had felt something crawl over him, and its breath cold against his skin. Then Blake said, "It is not safe anymore. We need answers, and we need them now." Meanwhile, Daniel had been exploring the abandoned section of the prison, where the air felt thick and suffocating. The walls were covered in strange, cryptic symbols carved into the stone. Some of them were simple and crude markings, while others were more detailed and unsettlingly precise. Then Daniel said to Elena, "These aren't just random markings. They are part of a ritual." Elena shivered. "Ritual? Like witchcraft?" "Something darker," Daniel replied. "Whoever carved these symbols was trying to summon or bind something." Then a sudden gust of wind howled through the corridor, blowing out the flashlight in Eleanor's hand. She swore under her breath and quickly tried to turn it back on. But when the beam finally flickered to life, it revealed a figure at the end of the hall. A tall and shadowy silhouette with glowing red eyes. Elena gasped and raised her weapon. "Stay back," she shouted, though her voice trembled with fear. But the figure didn't move. It simply stood there and watched them. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness. Then Daniel said, "We're running out of time," his voice tight with urgency. "Whatever is here, it is growing stronger." Daniel's footsteps echoed through the narrow corridor of the prison's most isolated wing. This part of Blackstone was different from the others because the walls were lined with thick steel, and the air was colder, and the silence felt heavier, almost like it was pressing down on him. Very few people came here, because this section housed only one inmate, Simon Grady. Simon wasn't known for violence or causing trouble. Instead, he was infamous because of his strange behavior and cryptic warnings. He had been transferred to Blackstone under mysterious circumstances, and even Warden Blake refused to talk about his past. When Daniel finally reached Simon's cell, he paused for a moment. Inside, Simon sat cross-legged on the floor, bathed in the dim light of a single flickering bowl. His long, tangled beard and hollow cheeks made him look more like a prophet than a prisoner. His piercing blue eyes stared ahead and unmoving. Then Simon said softly, "You have come," his voice calm, almost a calm. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but then stepped closer to the cell. "You know why I am here?" Simon tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Do I? Or are you here because they sent you?" "Who are they?" Daniel asked, his frustration clear in his voice. Simon chuckled, a low and unsettling sound that seemed to echo in the cold room. "The Forgotten Ones. They silenced and whispered to you. Don't they? They scream in the walls and in the air because they want you to understand their pain." Then Daniel's chest tightened. "You were talking about the spirits. What do they want from me?" Simon's expression turned serious, and he finally met Daniel's gaze. The intensity in his eyes was almost unbearable. Then he said, "Payment, a debt must be settled because blood was spilled here. Innocent blood, and their stories were buried with them. Now they rise and demand justice." "What justice?" Daniel pressed, and he said, "How do I stop them?" Simon leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You don't have to stop them, but you have to listen. But beware, because not all who linger seek peace. Some have been filled with rage for so long, and they have become something else. Shadows that devour, and they will come for you, Daniel." The sound of his name made a chill run down Daniel's spine. "How do you know my name?" Simon smiled again, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "I know more than you think. You are their only hope, but you are also a danger to them. So choose wisely." As Daniel turned to leave, Simon's voice followed him, soft but haunting. "Beware the dark, Daniel. It hides more than shadows." Daniel's mind raced as he left Simon's cell. Simon's words had unsettled him deeply, but he also gave him a strange feeling of purpose, because he said the spirits wanted something. Justice, revenge, or maybe just to be heard and to have their suffering acknowledged. That evening, Daniel went to the prison chapel and hoped to find some peace. It was one of the few places that seemed untouched by the strange energy that filled the rest of the prison. The faint smell of candle wax filled the air, and the stained glass windows cast colorful light onto the stone floor. Then, Daniel knelt in the center of the chapel. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He wasn't praying in the traditional way, but instead, he tried to reach out with his mind and call to the spirits, because he wanted answers and wanted to know what they needed. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and faint whispers filled the room. Daniel's heart started to pound, but he stayed calm. "Who's there?" he asked, and tried to keep his voice steady. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, a soft and sad voice replied, "James, my name is James." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "What happened to you, James?" he asked quietly. "I was killed for something I didn't do," the voice replied, trembling with emotion. "They needed someone to blame, and they didn't care who. I was just another prisoner to them." Daniel felt a wave of sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice gentle. "But I need your help. Why are the spirits here? And what do they want?" James' voice grew stronger, and his voice filled with anger. "We were forgotten. Our lives, our deaths. They buried it all, but it doesn't stay buried. Not forever." Daniel felt a strange pull, like an invisible thread pulling him towards something. Then James said, "There is something you need to see." Daniel followed the feeling to a corner of the chapel. He crouched down and pushed aside a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a hidden compartment. Inside, he found a rusted tin box. The surface was corroded, but it was still intact. With shaking hands, Daniel opened the box, and he saw an old journal inside it. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages were brittle, but the journal was still there. As Daniel flipped through the pages, his eyes widened in shock. The entries described the prison riot in gruesome detail, showing how the guards had planned the massacre to keep control of the prison. This was the proof Daniel had been looking for. But as he stood there and held the journal, a deep and chilling laugh echoed through the halls. The sound was dark and full of malice. Suddenly, Daniel's blood ran cold. The spirits were restless, and he realized that the darkness Simon had warned him about was getting closer. The danger wasn't just a story anymore. It was real. The brittle pages of the journal groaned under Daniel's trembling hands. He and Elena sat in the dim light of the prison chapel, the only place that felt even a little bit safe. Every entry Daniel read pulled them deeper into a terrifying history. The journal belonged to a former warden, Arthur Greaves, who had served in the 1940s. His entries described horrible acts of cruelty that had taken place during the riot. The prisoners were not just subdued, they were tortured. Their deaths were carefully planned and meant to serve as warnings to others. Some prisoners were taken to a secret chamber beneath the prison, where their lives were ended in what Greaves called purification rituals. "What the hell is this?" Elena whispered, and her voice was barely breaking the thick silence. Daniel's voice was heavy with unease. "These rituals, They weren't just executions. They were sacrifices. As Daniel continued reading, the journal revealed that the guards believed these rituals would trap the spirits of the prisoners and force them to obey in the afterlife. Greaves wrote about symbols carved into the walls and prayers offered to a dark entity he called the Keeper. Then Daniel said, they didn't just kill them, but they tried to control their spirits. Now the truth weighed heavily on them, and the air around them grew colder, and a faint whisper seemed to fill the room. Suddenly, Daniel froze because his senses were telling him they were not alone. Elena, we need to leave, he said, and stood up quickly. But as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered violently, and shadows danced on the walls and twisted into grotesque shapes. Suddenly a low, guttural growl echoed through the chapel, making the hairs on their necks stand on end. Put it back, a voice roared, thick with anger. Elena grabbed Daniel's arm tightly. What do we do? Daniel said. We keep moving, clutching the journal to his chest. This is their truth, and they don't want anyone to know it. Later, they managed to escape the chapel, but the experience left them shaken. The journal had answered some of their questions, but it had also raised many more. The anger of the spirits was undeniable, and Daniel knew they were closer than ever to uncovering the full truth and facing its terrifying consequences. The discovery of the journal led Daniel and Elena deep into the forgotten parts of the prison. After hours of searching, they finally found it. A hidden door behind a crumbling stone wall. The air on the other side was thick and heavy, almost as if it was pressing down on them. The room was like a nightmare come to life. Strange, ritualistic symbols covered the walls, and their sharp lines filled with dried blood. Charred bones were scattered across the floor, along with the decaying remains of what looked like ceremonial clothing. Elena gagged and covered her mouth. This is insane. Then, Daniel knelt in the center of the room, where a circle of black ash stained the floor. This is where it happened, he said, and his voice was hollow, almost lost. Elena asked, what happened? Her voice was full of fear. Then, Daniel replied quietly, they summoned something. Or at least, they tried to. He pointed to the symbols on the walls. These weren't meant to trap the spirits because they were offerings to the Keeper. As Daniel spoke, the air around them seemed to change, because the walls seemed to hum with energy, and the symbols glowed faintly. Now the dark and evil presence in the room grew stronger, and both Daniel and Elena could feel it pressing against their chests, like the room itself was alive. Then, suddenly, a loud thud echoed behind them. They turned to see the door they had entered slowly closing on its own, as if something was trying to keep them inside. Elena said, "We are not welcome here." Her voice was trembling with fear. "No," Daniel agreed, his face set with determination. "But we are staying until we understand what happened." Later Daniel and Elena went to Simon's room again, and Daniel said, "You knew about the ritual room?" Daniel accused, and his voice was sharp. Then Simon nodded slowly, and his eyes were filled with something unreadable. "I knew. Why didn't you say anything?" Elena asked, her voice full of frustration. Simon's lips curled into a faint and bitter smile. "Because I knew what it would unleash. My family's blood is on those walls, just like the prisoners." Then Daniel asked, "What are you talking about?" His curiosity was growing. Simon's voice was low and empty, and he said my great-grandfather was one of the executioners. He believed in the Keeper and thought it could give him power, but he didn't understand what he was really trapping. Before Simon could explain more, the air in the room suddenly changed. A violent wind rushed through, and shadows sprang from the walls, swirling around Simon like a deadly storm. He screamed and his body shook violently as the spirits attacked him. Daniel and Elena could only stand frozen and watch in horror as Simon collapsed. His eyes were wide and empty, his breathing shallow and ragged. Then Daniel whispered, "They're getting stronger." His voice was shaking. "If we don't stop this, everyone in this prison is in danger." Now the air felt thick with fear, because time was running out, and the spirit's rage was building to something much worse. Daniel knew the final confrontation was coming soon, and the answers they needed would come at a terrible price. Now the air in the prison grew heavier with each passing hour. Daniel knew the spirits were close to their breaking point. The journal had hinted at one entity controlling the rest. A powerful spirit known as the Warden, Arthur Greaves, a brutal officer who orchestrated the massacres and led the rituals to summon the Keeper. Greaves' spirit, corrupted by years of rage and guilt, now commanded the lost souls of Blackstone. Daniel sat with Eleanor in the Warden's office, the journal open on the desk. The dim light cast long shadows across the room, making it feel as if the darkness itself was listening. "You can't be serious," Eleanor said, her voice a mix of fear and frustration. "But it's the only way," Daniel replied, his tone resolute. "Greaves is the key. If I can reach him, I might be able to end this. And if you fail, if he takes you," Eleanor's voice cracked. Daniel hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He had no guarantees. The ritual he was planning to perform was unlike anything he had ever attempted. It involved invoking Greaves directly, using his bloodline symbols and artifacts from the ritual room to force a confrontation. "It's a risk I have to take," Daniel said finally. "The prison can't survive much longer like this, and neither can the people inside it." Eleanor clenched her fists, clearly torn. "Then I am staying with you," she said firmly. "No," Daniel said, shaking his head. "It has to be me alone. If something goes wrong." "I don't care," she interrupted. "I am not leaving you to face this alone." Daniel saw the determination in her eyes and knew he couldn't change her mind. Together, they gathered the necessary items, the symbols from the ritual room, candles, and a shard of charredwood from the original massacre site. As they descended into the bowels of the prison, the atmosphere grew colder, the walls seeming to close in around them. The whispers were louder now, unintelligible but maddening. In the center of the ritual room, Daniel set up the items. His hands trembled as he carved Mathis' symbol into the floor, the air crackling with an unnatural energy. "Eleanor, if this goes wrong, run," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, I am not leaving you," she replied, her voice steady. As the final symbol was completed, the candles flickered and then went out, plunging them into darkness. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the room, and the temperature dropped sharply. "He's here," Daniel said, his voice trembling. Finally, the Warden had arrived. The room exploded with a blinding light, and then darkness consumed everything. When Daniel's vision cleared, he saw him, the towering, grotesque form of the Warden. His figure was human-like, but distorted, his face twisted into a sneer of pure malice. Shadows writhed around him, forming the faces of the tormented souls he controlled. "Why have you summoned me?" The Warden's voice was a thunderclap, shaking the very walls. Daniel stood and tried to keep his fear under control. "You have caused this," he said, his voice trembling. "The suffering, the hauntings. It all starts with you." The Warden's laughter filled the room. "You think you understand. You know nothing. They were criminals, and I gave them what they deserved." "No," Daniel said, stepping closer. "They were people, and you didn't just punish them. You trapped their souls here. You can't hide from what you've done anymore." The spirits began to appear, their translucent forms circling the Warden. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming. Now the Warden's confident demeanor cracked as he looked around at the faces of his victims. "You can't silence them anymore," Daniel said. "It's time to let them go." The Warden roared in anger, and the room shook violently. Shadows lashed out at Daniel and Eleanor, but the spirits pushed back and their collective energy weakened the Warden's form. Then, Daniel clenched the journal tightly and shouted the final words of the ritual. Later the warden screamed and his form dissolved into darkness. The spirits turned to Daniel and their faces softened. Then, one by one, they began to fade and leave the room eerily silent. The prison was silent. The heavy and oppressive energy that had once filled every corner was gone, leaving only an eerie calm. The walls, once haunted by the tortured souls, now stood still, as if the prison itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The next day, Warden Blake announced his resignation. His guilt over the prison's dark history had become too much for him to carry. He could no longer stay in a place that had been built on pain and suffering. Eleanor, deeply moved by everything that had happened, left her position too. She decided to dedicate her life to fighting for prison reform, and determined that no place would ever suffer as Blackstone had. She believed that the system needed to change to prevent more lives from being destroyed. Daniel, on the other hand, chose a different path. He retreated into solitude and was unable to face the world outside. The physical scars on his body were a reminder of the horrors he had lived through, but they were nothing compared to the emotional toll. The memories of the spirits, their pain, their sorrow, stayed with him every day, a constant reminder of the battle he had fought. But despite the pain, Daniel found some peace. He knew that he had given the spirits what they needed, freedom. He had brought them peace, and that thought was enough to make him feel a little lighter. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.